Hi, this is Paul, and most of you will recognize Nathan Jacobs. We're here to talk, and Nathan is talking to me about his East-West series that he's developing. So I think that's where we'll start today. So,
Okay. Well, hey, Paul, it's good to see you. Yeah, so the East-West series, as I was mentioning right before we hopped on, basically this is a series that I'm in development on right now. And so if people are curious about it, you can go to the eastwestseries.com. That's the actual website, the eastwestseries.com. And I think also if you listen to any of my podcasts, you'll probably have the trailer pop up for it at some point in there as well. Or head over to my Substack, theologicalletters.com. Anyway, it's sort of all over the place if you know where to find me. But basically the concept was to do a video series that's looking at essentially the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. And as I broke down how I see the sort of core differences between the two, it came out to be about 25 lectures that are basically being written. So this is not just sort of like my podcast where I'm riffing and going off the cuff. This is actually like a properly scripted, filmed, edited series, which is why the pre-sales are part of the development funding to actually make it possible. But the idea is, I broke that out and I really saw 25 lectures as the core of what I wanted to get to in terms of fleshing out the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. And that covers a variety of topics: the doctrine of God, Christology, Trinity, salvation, ecclesiology, things like that. But the reason I wanted to do that, the reason I thought that was really important, was because I think there's this burgeoning interest in Orthodox. Anybody who's paying attention online or paying attention to what's happening in the news, right? Even news outlets like the New York Times is covering it, or visit an Orthodox church. They know there's this growing interest in Eastern Orthodoxy. And me speaking as somebody who's training, right, is in historical theology, at least that's part of my training, obviously philosophy and other things too. But, looking at this from a purely objective sort of historical perspective, which is the tone and tenor of what I tend to do, um, I'm not always convinced that people who are intrigued by Orthodoxy or encountering Orthodoxy really know what it is that they're looking at. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to flesh that out because, again, people who have listened to me in the past, they know I tend to speak just historically and objectively, right? Here we're looking at this doctrine, and here is the way that doctrine develops in the Latin West, and we move through, the usually some sort of pre-Augustinian or Augustinian patristic context, medieval, and then post-Reformation, the contrast between how that develops in later Catholicism and how that contrasts with the Protestant traditions. And then contrast that with here's what we find in the Christian East, and drawing that contrast without necessarily telling anybody what to do with that, right? Who to side with, or maybe you reject all of it. I don't know, right? But offering that sort of historical, objective perspective is the thing that I tend to do. And the reason I thought that was really important is because there are certain patterns that I've seen. And I'll be curious to see if you see other patterns, given that you are not only, obviously a pastor, but you also are plugged into these corners of the internet that are talking about these sorts of things. But I had noticed that on the one hand, you saw internal to those who are curious about Orthodoxy, you see several different groups. You see people who will sometimes convert to Orthodoxy, and I'm not convinced they fully understand what they've converted to, right? They're sort of interested in Orthodoxy. There's something about it that's drawing them to it, or perhaps there's something that they're retreating from. And they encounter Orthodoxy and they're not really sure what they're looking at. And so they sort of itemize, this is rather common, they itemize their hangups, right? Like, I'm not sure how I feel about this Mary stuff or prayers to saints stuff. And they sort of give, or icons, right? They give their sort of short list and they look for answers to overcome those hurdles. And then they just presume that everything they didn't trip up on is the same. And so you end up in this sort of odd, unintentional syncretism where you've carried in a bunch of, say, Protestant or Catholic theology, and you've just sort of traded out a few little hiccups here and there to try to make it comfortable for you. But you haven't really actually turned over the soil of your worldview. So you end up with some sort of odd, syncretism there. You have that sort of thing. You have other folks who are sort of drawn to Orthodoxy and they really don't fully feel like they understand it. Maybe they don't feel like they need to understand it, which is fine, right? I'm all for the idea of the faith being lived and so on. But I think there are a number of people who are drawn to it and intrigued by it who really don't feel like they could fully articulate what are the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West. You also have people on the Western side, right, who are saying, I'm running into these encounters with Orthodoxy and we have disagreements, but I'm not sure they even know how to frame the disagreements. Okay, we disagree about the atonement or about salvation. I'm hearing these things from Orthodox folks, and they're trying to come to grips with what is it that we're encountering. I have parishioners who are interested in this thing, and I don't quite know what to say about it. And so when I look across the spectrum and I see inquirers into Orthodoxy, whether it's people who have converted or people who are curious, um, I'm not always convinced that they feel like they know what they're looking at. Right, and this will come through in certain things like I feel myself at a crossroads between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And when I hear that, unless your entire question just is about papal supremacy, right? Like if that's the one question that you're hung up on, you're like, I just want to know whether I should, follow Rome. Um, if you're really just contrasting those two things, those are on different planets, right? Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy are quite different in terms of worldview and theology. And so when I hear that sort of thing, I say, well, does this person really even understand what they're looking at? Do they understand the root differences between the Christian East and the Christian West? And like I said, with converts, I oftentimes wonder, have they really turned over their soil and have a fully Orthodox worldview, or have they just traded out a few things so they can step in? And then obviously, when you look at polemics, people who are starting to attack Orthodoxy online because, it seems to be a threat, right? Either to Protestantism or Catholicism or whatever, the polemics usually don't tend to display a great deal of understanding of what you're really looking at. And then you just sort of add to that the myriad of voices that you can go to online in terms of trying to investigate these things. And I think there's just a very real need for a clear place for people to go to just in order to understand what the differences are. So this series isn't a polemic, right? It's not me sitting here saying, hey, everybody, here's why Orthodoxy is good, and here's why, the West, every Western tradition is bad, and this is why you should be Orthodox and not be Catholic or Protestant. That's definitely not the tone and tenor of the series. The tone and tenor of the series, and I'm very clear in the first lecture, like, I'm not a representative of the Orthodox Church. I'm Orthodox, sure, right? But I'm speaking as a historical theologian in the series. And all I'm looking to do is bring into the light what are the root differences between the East and the West? How did they emerge? How did they develop over time? And then you, the listener, gets to decide what to do with that, right? So if you're a polemicist and you're on the side of the West, and now at least you know what you're attacking, right? You know what you disagree with. If you're somebody who's looking, you're sort of torn, there's something that appeals to you about Orthodoxy, that appeals about Roman Catholicism, at least you know what the fork in the road is that you face. If you're Orthodox already, you've converted, and you're sitting there going, am I really Orthodox? Am I thinking? Now, this is a way for you to look at your worldview and say, well, how much of my Western stuff have I retained and sort of carried into the Orthodox Church? So I see all these different needs that are there. And that was really the need that I wanted to fill by offering to basically the burgeoning conversation, debate, controversy, whatever you want to call it. I wanted to offer that as a touch point that people could go to and say, like, at least this is offering some clarity to the discussion, to the decisions, to those sorts of things. So that's kind of the rub of it, I suppose.
Well, I wanted to record when you started this because there are hosts of questions that come to my mind, not all of which we can really begin to fathom, because from a pastoral perspective, obviously, people enter into something usually based on a couple of low resolution impressions,
Yeah.
and then they enter into a particular congregation with a particular priest with a particular community within part of within a particular branch, because Orthodoxy, one of the things that I've been impressed by, um, having had a lot of conversations over the last 8 years because of the Peterson Peugeot pipeline,
Hmm.
is I really look forward to this series, because when people talk about Orthodoxy, and I listen to people who have individuals who have sort of come into there at that point as an individual, and they talk about it, to me, it's like, why are we using a singular noun for this? Because when I look at what's going on, it's like, I really sort of want to talk about orthodoxies,
Hmm.
because they are all over the map. And I've had, I can easily say that with respect to Protestants. Protestants will, cough this up readily because it's unavoidable.
Hmm.
Roman Catholics, some of them will fight you on it, but it's like, come on, people, I'm looking around here, and
Right.
they'll say, so you got a pope. I get that, but it's abundantly clear that at any given time, not all of you are submitting to this fella,
Right.
and or even think he should be it, or some of you don't even know if he's a Christian.
Mhm.
So, and so I see the benefits of a project to attempt to distill. I mean, even among 25 or so lectures where there are going to be 25 points of inflection where you can say, here's, so we can use these dichotomies, East and West.
Hmm.
We can use Latin, Greek.
Hmm.
And, part of this is also, none of these churches actually also escape the the cultural, political, religious environment of the present,
Hmm.
as they have all been reacting to and dealing with those realities of the past. In, you look at, let's say, the Roman Empire,
Hmm.
which then very quickly have the Eastern and the Western. It was always sort of a, iron and clay thing there. And so this is going to be very interesting. Let me float, and I'm going to assume that the vast majority of, oh boy, because you have the cradle Orthodox who, let's say, grew up in the East
Hmm.
within a linguistic cultural framework
Yeah.
after nation states sort of emerged in the modern period, and to whatever degree those Eastern nation states are nation states, as opposed to, say, some of the things that have formed in the West, such as Italy and Germany, which are self-consciously this. So you have all of these different ethnic groups, all of these different religions. You've got, especially in Eastern Europe, many of those empires were multi-ethnic empires.
Hmm.
And part of what you saw in the 20th century after the First World War and after the Second World War was sort of a sorting out, similar to, say, what you saw with the fall of the Soviet Union, when suddenly Russians in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine is one of the obvious examples, but that happens all throughout this union of Soviet socialist republics. One of the things that's occurred to me recently, I just had a conversation this week with the author of a book I'm reading. He's a professor at Redeemer University, which is in little Christian college in Ontario.
Hmm.
And he wrote a book on secularization, and he's taking from Philip Reef, kind of adapted it, and talking about a sacred social order, talking about the fact that this word religion is so conflicted, because when you look in the past, you'll even have someone like Rationality Rules that imagines that it was the most. I don't know if you saw this conversation he had with Glenn Scrivener, where he begins the thing and says, "I'm going to tell you a story that I want you all to remember throughout this whole debate. Here is the human story, that we were all just somehow pure humans, which were just full of love and kindness and openness, and then this evil thing called religion came in and poisoned the well.
Hmm.
And now what we have to do is get rid of, I mean, and it's just shocking to me when you have someone who purports to sort of be an atheist materialist constructs this story
Hmm.
as sort of a human anthropology. And it's like, boy, Rousseau really one-shotted you, Bob.
That's exactly what I was just thinking.
But so part of what, I've been working through lately because Kevin Flatt at the end of that conversation, will be out later this week or early next week in full, is he says, so he's watching the Orthodox fascination
Hmm.
and he's thinking about it, and he's trying to, as are many people, trying to say, how can we get our heads around this? And again, as a pastor, when you're not dealing with statistics, but you're dealing with individuals, one of the things you realize as you get into every single person's story who comes into your church and you start getting into their story, you realize that they have 100 implicit, often unconscious, low resolution motivations
Hmm.
to say, oh, I like this place. I like these people. Now we get into, this feels authentic to my journey, and so I'm going to be here at least for a while. And so off they go. And I've talked to, many people in recorded and unrecorded conversations who have found their way into Orthodoxy and found healing. And they found a lot of what they were looking for when they went in there. I've talked to some who have not. Um, and that's pretty much normal to be expected. So one of the things that struck me about this sort of return to these older traditions, and older can be Anglican, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and of course, even when we say Roman Catholic, you've got Spanish Catholic, Italian Catholic, French Catholic, German Catholic, then you've got Latin America. I mean, so it goes all over the place. But one of Kevin Flatt's arguments is that every culture that we can find, with the difficult possible exception of what has happened in the West, attempts to locate its people in what he calls a sacred social order,
Hmm.
where it's what Calvinists have long talked about, a worldview.
Hmm.
You have higher and lower. You have center and fringes. It's a lot of what Peugeot has sort of walked everyone through. And part of what struck me about, let's say, evangelicals and Protestants, and their interest in Orthodoxy and their interest in some of these other older traditions, has been these older traditions continue to display a sacred social order. And part of what happens with Protestantism, especially when you get into, let's say, American evangelicalism, which is deeply shaped by the frontier, you've got all these people living in chaos. The only book they can carry is the Bible. The Bible is sort of the only thing that they can find common language with refugees from other traditions that aren't, have sort of made their way out to the frontier. This is Mark Knoll's Christian frontier thesis.
Hmm.
Is so you really thin things down, and then you get things like now, the interesting demand that atonement may only be understood as substitutionary atonement. That's the only atonement
Yeah.
metaphor that is permissible. And so it breaks it obviously down into a very forensic, narrow. In other words, it's a very streamlined gospel.
Sure.
And that's handy in certain contexts and places,
Hmm.
because you can derive something from it. You can organize a community. You can do all the kinds of things that people need. But I think part of the reason people are looking back to older traditions is you have much more fully worked through sacred social order, where and in fact, Dawn Muir on one of my Friday Estuary groups, she articulated it very, very well when she said, she had been part of a really interesting sort of invisible Christian sect that I bumped into a few places, which
Mhm.
is it's Unitarian. It's strictly biblicistic to the point that they don't allow themselves to take a name for what they do. Sometimes they're called two by twos. And it's a really interesting little hyper biblicistic restorationist group that is just sort of out there in the world. And, her argument about what she found with Orthodoxy was, oh, I received from the Bible these strange words like angels and demons and I didn't really quite know what to do. And so how Orthodoxy has been helpful is that suddenly there's a much bigger world I can inhabit. And what struck me is that Richard Rowland, now Deacon Seraphin Rowland, said essentially the same thing to me when he was talking about his leaving, a certain kind of revivalist evangelicalism. So I think that's part of it. But again, I'm not so much dealing with an attempt to distill essences
Mhm.
and find out, okay, this is the essence of orthodoxy,
Mhm.
because again, there's huge amounts of, I mean, it's so funny when people say, well, I like reading the church fathers. Okay,
Mhm.
uh which ones? Because there's a lot there. So I'm curious both about the idea of this sacred social order to the degree that I've been able to convey it, but then also your project of how on earth are you going to make useful categories
Mhm.
that can really sort of distill through this inexhaustible amount of time and detail that
Mhm.
is history for a lot of the planet for the last 2,000 years.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot. That's a lot, Paul. Let's see what I can do for you. So in terms of the first question, in terms let me reframe it a little bit, and I think you can probably sort of take the categories that I would use and put it into this framework. One of the things that I would definitely clarify whenever I'm talking about sort of the patterns that I see in the movement toward orthodoxy is I'm clearly talking about like a largely North American phenomenon, right? And so I think it always needs to be acknowledged that culturally, we are different than a lot of the rest of the world when it comes to religion. And so just the very fact, and I think this goes to our Protestant roots, right? So much of the Protestant and Enlightenment roots that are here in the United States, and not just in the United States, in North America generally, is that there is a certain tendency to enter things through a critical lens, right? I'm going to think through things. I'm going to do worldview work. I'm going to scrutinize the premises. And there's always something kind of ironic about becoming a Roman Catholic or becoming Orthodox through what is essentially a Protestant enterprise. So that's always rather an interesting, quirk, I would say. And yet, at the same time, I just acknowledge that at this point, it's baked into us that we are products of modernity, and we have trouble removing those modernist lenses and impulses. And it's actually one of the reasons why I think it's so important to actually start to walk through the history of ideas the way I tend to do, because the step toward actually scrutinizing my own motives, my own choices, moving from low resolution to high resolution, to use, that metaphor, is partially just starting to become aware of the lenses that we use, because we take them for granted so much that this is just what it means to be human, as opposed to recognizing, no, this is what it means to be human at this point in the flow of history. where we have already worked through the Enlightenment and we've sort of elevated reason in the way that we have in terms of how we approach epistemology, the fact that we believe that we have actual choices to make in terms of choosing what sort of worldview and culture and career and everything else that we choose the elevation of choice and self-determination the way we do. And so a lot of times I think sometimes, some of the times when I will talk about certain patterns with conversion to Orthodoxy or patterns within the Orthodox world, I think sometimes people think I'm speaking globally, but I would readily acknowledge I go to talk to Orthodox people in Greece, it's a totally different animal because they are not out of a Protestant culture. They do not approach religion the same way we do in North America. And so immediately you have to acknowledge that sort of thing. And then when I look at specifically the way in which folks in North America begin to approach things, I see a few different things happening here. And so it's true, as you talked about these various sort of low resolution reasons people start to move toward things. Uh, I see a variety of those, right? So for some people, it's just I'm disappointed. There's something about the feel. You brought up feeling, right? There's something about my current, religious experience that feels shallow, or it doesn't feel ancient. It doesn't feel authentic, right? You use that word. And those are oftentimes indicators of something that's deeper, but there's not a vocabulary for saying what is it that I'm feeling. And then there's this sense, right? Just a feeling of contrast. When I step into an Orthodox church, something about this feels more authentic, right? Whatever that might mean. So sometimes it's a vague aesthetic, right? Or vague religious inclination. I think sometimes there's a sense that, speaking for my own journey, that religion should deal in the holy. And there's something that feels secular and common and not reverent and not holy about certain types of religious environments or cultures. And so all of a sudden you step into this and it's like, this feels more like what religion should feel like, something like that. And so I think you have some of, if we're talking low resolution impulses, that's one of them. I think there's also for some people, the low resolution impulse that might emerge is just saying there seems to be a very big gap in my picture of history. Given the worldview I've embraced, I kind of have to skip over 1500 years and maybe more, in order to get to the religion that I practice. And something just feels off about that. And I want to feel more rooted and connected. I think this is one of the reasons why one of the things, I don't know if it's as much of a trend anymore, but I know with a lot of evangelicals, probably a couple of decades back, there was a deep fascination with Judaism. And the reason was I want to feel connected to the past. Um, and I can't because I'm saying Catholicism is bad, right? But what if I could jump over Catholicism and start to practice Passover and like and I could just really dig into the religion that Jesus practiced, right? Like that's what I could do, right?
Dave Busatil, he's talking about you in case you didn't notice. Keep going, Nathan.
So so that sort of jumping over to feel connected, I think that's one of the low resolution impulses that says I do feel like if this is authentically something that, I mean, just consider the biblical narrative. If this is something that is deep in, ancient humanity that over time developed organically, um, given to us by God, and I am the recipient of it, I shouldn't have a giant gap and the tether between me and that. And so that gap feels off, right? And so that, that can lead people to go into church history. It can lead them to go into patrology, right? Whatever it might be. And so there's those sorts of low resolution things that are there. I also think in some ways, and this goes to my research on the religiously unaffiliated, which obviously you know about. That's how we first encountered each other. Um, but when looking at the sort of patterns, what's interesting is I did a series of lectures, not in the ones that you first listened to, where I talked about like the dynamics of the religiously unaffiliated, what they tend to believe, and why aspects of the worldview more easily map onto Orthodox thinking than Western thinking. But I also have since done work on sort of the indicators of when somebody might begin to become theologically unstable or become, they start to switch, right? And so they untether from their tradition and they start to wander around and look at other things, and at some point dissociate if they can't find what they're looking for, as well as looking at the patterns of, you know, conversion. And not surprisingly, those two things line up very well. And you start to see that some of the indicators, some of the predictors of switching are oftentimes existential, they're experiential. They're things like as simple as, do my parents practice this religion at home, or just do they go on Sundays, or worse, they only go on, Christmas and Easter, right? Do they affirm what the church is teaching, or are they like, yeah, we go to church, but yeah, don't listen to the church. They're all wrong on this sort of thing. Are they in agreement? Does one practice the religion and does the other not? In things like divorce, right? In the divorce, okay, well, do the parents in this situation or in crisis generally turn to the religion, or do they turn to something else? And so do they talk about the religion at home? There's a lot of these sort of factors that basically, if you distill them down, it comes down to, did it seem like this thing was practiced, believed, lived, and produced an environment that felt authentic, right? It felt in some ways healthy and good and right. And if the answer is it felt efficient, and that can be in the home life, it can also be, it carries over onto the church life. Did I feel like my pastor didn't really care and this was just a job? Did I feel like there was a place for me within the church? A lot of the same sort of things carry over into the ecclesial context. You can see that oftentimes the dissociation and the switching is a product of those sorts of features. And then when you look at, there was a dissertation done actually in Michigan on reconversion. This is looking specifically to Catholicism and to more traditional forms of Catholicism, which tends to be what the conversions are. It's interesting. You can see the exact parallel.
Hmm.
It oftentimes involves encounters with people, sometimes monks or nuns or priests or somebody like that, who really does in flesh or in body the sort of thing that they didn't experience growing up. So there's something here that feels grounded, that feels sober, that feels holy, that feels lived and incarnate about this faith tradition. Um, and I think also with that, there's this transitional phase that you also find with the nuns. So one of the things that I've talked about with the religiously unaffiliated is that the evolution of a nun, that nun, N-O-N-E-S, right, for everybody, right, the religiously unaffiliated, not Catholic or Orthodox nuns or something like that. But the evolution of the religiously unaffiliated tends to be a certain form of disillusion that moves into switching, like I talked about. If they don't find something that grounds them, they end up dissociating. And that could be either I have no religion, I'm a nun, right? Or it means I'm a done, meaning I'm done with church. I would still say I believe in Jesus. Maybe I even call myself a Christian, but I don't practice it, right, in any way. And what's interesting is about once that dissociation happens, there is first one of the first stages that people move through is they actually move into the paranormal and the occult. And that's one of the things that I've talked about in the past, which is kind of surprising for a lot of people. But I'm not the only person who noted this, right? The Pew Research Center noted this. Clay Rutledge ended up dealing with this, sociologist. And basically, I think when you interview the religiously unaffiliated, you can see why, right? And the reason is that oftentimes when talking about the existential side of this, the religiously unaffiliated will talk about the problem of evil, but what they're describing is not the problem of evil, it's the problem of divine hiddenness. I wanted God to show up. My parents were in crisis and I prayed and God didn't answer, right? It's this idea that where is God in the midst of this? And and so the movement toward the paranormal and the cult is actually a movement toward I still want to know that I live in a spiritual world. I still want some sort of meaning. And if God won't talk to me, but something else will move a Ouija board or talk into my, tape recorder or, give me some sort of thrill or woo, right, related to the paranormal, that's good enough, right? It still tells me I'm in a spiritual world. And since I'm not doing an organized religious practice, that scratches that itch that says I'm still a spiritual being in a spiritual world. And so as long as I'm living in a way that, is me being a good person, I'm fulfilling that spiritual need with that sort of vague spirituality. But the problem is, as Clay Rutledge also pointed out, there's an inverse relationship between a sense of meaning and the paranormal and the occult. So the deeper you go into it, the less meaning you experience. And so normally what happens is that leads to disillusion. At some point, there starts to be a burnout and a sense of meaninglessness in the midst of this vague spirituality.
Hmm.
The result is actually predictably a movement toward basically politics, where essentially you trade out the search for meaning in the spiritual for the search for meaning in the social and political. And that's one of the reasons why when people are like, well, it seems almost like people are almost religious in their zeal about political issues, it's because they're not almost religious, they are religious in the pursuit of that. And no surprise, that also becomes a form of burnout. You find yourself angry, you find yourself depressed, you find yourself not finding the sort of meaning that you're looking for. And I think the thing that's rather intriguing is that all sets the stage oftentimes for some type of crisis. And that crisis can be it can be something as simple as I'm having kids and suddenly I'm looking at the world and I'm looking at morality and I'm looking at how do I raise this person and you start to rethink religion. Sometimes you talked about the Peugeot-Peterson, pipeline. Sometimes it's just that they're running up against aspects of the worldview in the political space that just don't seem right. And so they start to rethink things and question what they think, and they start to find that the people they're listening to or resonating with are all religious. And so they start to think, well, maybe religion isn't dumb. But there's a number of different places where this goes, where there's usually some form of encounter. Oftentimes, actually, one of the more peculiar or unexpected one is you just go down the pipeline of weird internet stuff like giants and conspiracy theories, and before you know it, even though you're listening to people who are talking about UFOs and whatever else, you're now into giant lore and alternate histories, and all of a sudden the religions are back into the conversation, and so you start to rethink things a little bit, and that will oftentimes be its own sort of catalyst for starting to listen to voices, oftentimes in Orthodox circles like Lord of Spirits or something like that, that is unexpected, and now you're starting to rethink what you thought you knew about Christianity. So whatever the reason, there's usually some sort of thing that sets them, reopens them to religion. But of course, the reopens is not, I'm going to go back to my roots because that was empty. And so now I'm looking for something new. And and if you still have a tether to Christianity, I think this is one of the things that I've talked about, that Orthodoxy has an advantage precisely because it's different, right? It's
Yep.
different aesthetically, it's different in terms of its ethos, it's different culturally, and it's different theologically. And so all of a sudden, it allows somebody who is still inclined to think, if I were to return to religion, I guess what I'm most comfortable with is Christianity because I grow out of a Christian culture, but I can't go back to that. Orthodoxy suddenly has appeal because it's like looking at Christianity anew,
Yes.
which is something you can't really do if you were raised. And incidentally, I'll just as a quick aside, because I think this may be relevant as we move forward. I think this is one of the reasons why sometimes cradles have a harder time with the revitalization of an Orthodox faith, because for them, Orthodoxy is the water that they swam in. And I think this oftentimes happens in cradle cultures. It happens I think, in Greek cultures, it's oftentimes there because for the Greeks, as contrasted with, say, the Antiochians, the Arabs, you end up having it's kind of like the Italians. Like, am I Catholic? I'm Italian. Of course I'm Catholic, right? And so for a lot of Greeks, it's the same way. Are you Orthodox? Like, of course I'm Greek. And it's borderline cultural in that sense. It's not something that it's the water that you swim in, and it's more of a sort of a root association. And so that sort of cultural experience, I think once you have that, maybe I should clarify why I contrasted with that with the Arabs. Arabs, from my experience with, Arabs who are here in North America, who are in the Antiochian tradition, they tend to not think of their culture as Christian. They think of their culture as Muslim. And so, for that reason, they end up thinking of themselves and their Christianity as a choice that's already countercultural. And so that's very different, right? Because it forces you to make a choice contrary to your culture, as opposed to if it's a cultural default, you know, and we just do whatever we do in our culture. And of course, we're Orthodox. That's a very different sort of ethos that's there. And I think that's one of the reasons why oftentimes the Greeks will struggle with this because they have such an Orthodox root culture. And so that's one of the things, and I offered this as a side because, as I said, like when you've become disillusioned with something, right? And then you've stepped away from it, and then you want to reconsider it, it becomes hard to look at it anew, right? It becomes hard to embrace it as if you never knew it before and see it with fresh lenses. That becomes difficult. Whereas if you come out of a Protestant tradition or a Catholic tradition, and then you look at Orthodoxy, and it is all new to you,
Yeah.
right? That becomes easier. But if you're a Greek, let's say you've been raised Orthodox, and you had all of those same experiences that I talked about that incline you to switch and then dissociate. Now coming back to that becomes harder for you than it does for somebody else. Now it can still happen. I've encountered plenty of people who have, gone through that journey, but it's in some ways harder. You're at a disadvantage in that way when reconsidering those things. But anyway, I offer that picture of the nuns because I think there's a critical phase within there that goes to the things that you're talking about when you're talking about this sense of well, let's call it something like an integrated or a holistic life, right? A way of being. And I think that's one of the things that happens in that disillusionment stage, the stage where you've become untethered from what you were raised in. You go into this vague spirituality, and that doesn't satisfy. You move into the political space and you try to create a fully integrated worldview, but you end up just consumed with the madness of politics. And you're looking for something that can be fully integrated. And it's interesting how many of these phases, like this sort of final phase of return, oftentimes comes with things like, should I get married or did I just get married? Should I have kids, right? There starts to be this search for, I want a fully integrated life, a life where what I have at home, and notice that this is exactly what hypothetically under the switching data you didn't really have. I want a life that is fully integrated, where my marriage is rooted in this. The raising of my children is rooted in this. What we do religiously outside of the home is rooted in this. What we do religiously within the home is rooted with this. I think this is one of the appeal for so many young men who are looking for someone to tell them how to live, and they want discipline. And I think one of the things that Orthodoxy ends up appealing to a lot of folks who are looking at those sorts of things is Orthodoxy does tell you these are the services you're supposed to come to, and we have a lot of them. This is how you're supposed to pray. This is how you're supposed to pray at home. This is what it looks like. It involves rituals like candles and incense, prayer ropes that you're supposed to carry with you and be trying to, learn how to perpetually pray. It talks to you about how you fast, right? It starts to organize your life according to a liturgical calendar. If you get married, it's seen as a sacramental thing that you are integrated into together. You have children, they're baptized, all these sorts of things. Obviously, some of those things overlap with other traditions, obviously. But I think Orthodoxy, when you see it practiced, right, as opposed to just being a cultural phenomenon, when you see somebody who has really embraced it and is trying to live it fully, what you start to see is it's their entire life. And I think that's that thing that's being looked for. And so, as I talked about, when looking at the reconversion data, oftentimes it is that encounter with something that is fully lived and fully integrated that has appeal because that's what the person is looking for. And so I think on the cultural front, that's one of the things that I see happening there. And I suspect that we could very easily translate that into the terms that you set up the question with,
Yeah.
begin with.
Yeah.
Um, So that's the pattern that I see based on sort of the North American religiously dissociation, switching, reconversion data that
Yeah.
I see going on there. Um, and obviously, like I said, there's any number of pathways of what opens it up. It can be life experiences, it can be philosophy, right? It can be certain rabbit trails you go through, it can be just sort of reconsidering religion generally. The catalyst for it is oftentimes different, but the root desire is oftentimes common across the board with all of that. So that's one of the things that I see there. Now, in terms of, how do you approach orthodoxies? I think this is, from a historical theological perspective, I don't think it's very difficult. What makes it seem confusing and difficult, and I think for a lot of people, is actually the internet and what we're doing right here. Because what you start to have is you have a lot of voices out there, and I encounter this quite a bit, and I won't name any names, right? But there are certain voices out there that will oftentimes speak about the Orthodox view of this, that, or the other, right? And oftentimes what they're saying is not Orthodox. Sometimes it's actually contrary to Orthodoxy. That is out there. Other times it's just a permissible view within the Orthodox, church, but it's not the Orthodox position. The church has no dogmatic stance on this. And so you have this sort of spectrum from you have this spectrum of these things that are claimed to be Orthodox that are not, to things that are permissibly Orthodox but are not like dogmatically Orthodox. And yet, what you see is you see a lot of people who are interested in Orthodoxy and come into Orthodoxy will start to talk and they'll be like, yeah, I mean, it really blew my mind when I heard that the Orthodox Church teaches and fill in the blank. And I go, do they? Right. And so you have this when you have this sort of pairing of an Enlightenment Protestant impulse of I'm constructing worldview and scrutinizing things. And so I'm going into this granular sort of work about all these different doctrines, and I'm listening to all these different voices. And you pair that with the internet and just the fact that anybody out there can just start to put, their voice out in terms of what is orthodox or what is not. You end up having a proliferation of a lot of people who have sort of this oddly, I mean, we could call it syncretistic sort of worldview where they're sort of picking and choosing all these different bits that they're hearing from online and thinking them to be orthodox because they're listening and consuming in good faith and they're grabbing hold of the things that excite them or interest them, and they begin to bring them into the Orthodox Church then. And I think some of that is there's with that there's an unfortunate impulse that I think actually goes to one of the things that I mentioned. I mentioned one of the odd pipelines being, that people go down the UFO path or, conspiracy paths or whatever it might be, and that starts to lead them to certain Orthodox voices. Um, with that, sometimes there is, as part of that itch, right, that old paranormal itch that I mentioned at one point in the evolution of a religiously unaffiliated person, there's an itch that I would consider to actually be kind of Gnostic where what I want is I want the cryptic and the weird and the idiosyncratic. I want the esoteric. I want to be one of the people who's in the know about things that other people aren't in the know about. And so rather than sort of gravitating toward the things in orthodoxy that might tell you how to kick addictions or grow in virtue or something like that, there's a tendency to go, give me the weirdest, most obscure stuff. And you see that sort of tendency there. And I think that's one of the reasons that will oftentimes mean that there's a proliferation of some of those more idiosyncratic, peculiar things, because those are the things that people are glomming onto. And of course, the internet encourages that. The weirder it is of what you're talking about, the more controversial or odd it is, the more the internet loves you, right? And so there's also this this other feedback loop happening there that's algorithmic, I suppose, in terms of, in terms of how these things are put out there. So that's one of the reasons that I think there is a tendency, there's sort of an amplified tendency within our current context to see a lot of orthodoxies, like you were talking about. I think historically speaking, when you sort of strip that stuff away, and this is where I'm looking with the series to help remedy some of that and offer some amount of clarity. I think one of the things that you see, and this is where I make clear in the series when I talk about East and West, I make clear I'm not going to be talking about the Orthodox Church, right? I'm going to be talking largely about the root, theology that is, of course, the root theology of the Orthodox Church, which is the Eastern Church Fathers and the ecumenical councils and things like that in the first millennium. That's what I'm going to focus on. Now, are these things affirmed by the Orthodox Church? Yes. But does the Orthodox Church continue to sort of live and offer its own prescriptions and things like that? Of course it does. And so that's where, when I'm working through the series, I'm really sort of focusing on the patristic, the Eastern patristic way of thinking things, thinking through things. And I think when you do that, I mean, cards on the table. I know that there are a number of patrologists and people like that who would try to suggest that the Eastern Church Fathers disagree with each other about a number of things. And I'm not actually one of the people who's resonant with that. So I talk about all of this in the first lecture in order to give clear methodology and my stance on these sorts of things. I tend to think that I read the Eastern Church Fathers as being in agreement on things like, on their Trinitarian theology, on their Christology, on their understanding of the gospel, on these core things. And I think when you see the way in which they understand those, you can see that all those things are interlocking, right? So when it comes to the seven ecumenical councils, for example, of the first millennium, right? These being, as you obviously know, but in case any of the listeners don't know, right? These councils where it was East and West coming together in order to address the controversy that was so big that it threatened to tear Christendom apart. And the most famous of these, of course, is Nicaea, from which we get the Nicene Creed, which is really born out of the first two councils, Nicaea and Constantinople. But nobody wants to say the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, so we just say the Nicene Creed. Um, and so, like, those seven ecumenical councils, I think if you look at those seven ecumenical councils and you look at them in the light of the Eastern Church Fathers who are involved in those controversies, what you start to see is that these are not just punctuated issues, right? When they talk about Mary, that's not just a random topic that's coming up. It's intimately tied with their discussion of Christology and the incarnation born out of the Nestorian dispute. And so the controversy about Mary and what it wants to say about Mary, what the church wants to say about Mary in that controversy is all about, they know that what you're going to say about Mary has ramifications for the incarnation, what you're saying about Christ. And so there's a real sense in which I think when you distill down the ecumenical councils, what you start to see is that there is a very clear sense of what the gospel is. And there's a very clear sense of the ways in which your Trinitarianism, your Christology, your Mariology, your iconography all have something to say about that. And if missteps are made here, can threaten the gospel as they understand it. And so for that reason, it's highly integrated. Now, the reason I think it's important to see that is that's where I see the core agreement between the Eastern Fathers. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that the Eastern Fathers have what's called within the Orthodox Church a theologumenon, right? Theological opinions, and these are things that are considered to be gray areas, where the Church Fathers do have differing opinions. And so there's a spectrum of possibilities here in terms of what you might say about that sort of thing that are all within the pale of orthodoxy and they're all permissible. Now, the way I approach this, though, is again, I think, and this is really sort of addressing a modernist and a Protestant impulse. I think a lot of folks who have been raised in an evangelical context, for example, they're accustomed to thinking about theology like Lego pieces, right? I can just sort of take this one and I can attach it to this one. If I don't like that one, I can take it out and I can put it here. And they're all sort of insulated from one another. They're just punctiliar, sort of data that I can sort of toy around with. And if I can find a coherent way to assemble this one with that one, like it's fine. Whereas I think when you look at the Eastern Fathers, what you start to see is that that core that I talked about, it's less like Legos. This is not my metaphor. This is actually somebody else's who I have to credit for this. Um, these are not Lego pieces, but puzzle pieces, and they do fit together in a specific way. And once you see that, what's interesting is you can begin to then see a common underlying rationale in things that are gray, where you can see that even where there's disagreement, there's root agreement about certain things. I'll give you an example so it's not so abstract, right? Can angels be redeemed? Okay. If you look at the Eastern Church Fathers, no surprise, there's a majority opinion, which that oftentimes is. In theological opinion areas, you'll have a majority report and then a series of minority divergent points. And so majority report, no, angels can't be redeemed. And for many of them, that's just taken to be obvious. It's taken to be a given. Oftentimes, they are so attuned to what the underlying rationale is within their world that they say it in a single sentence, like we all know it. And so John of Damascus does this, like, yeah, of course, like angels can't be redeemed, they're simple. And that's all he'll have to say about it. Now, thankfully, me as a metaphysician, I can sit here and I know from digging around what John is talking about. And if we look at it, if we look at what, John is talking about, he understands that, the complexity of man as a body-soul hybrid means that if we become corrupt, we can actually be disassembled or unmade and then fixed and remade. And this is part of how they see the gift of death and the dissolution of the body and the separation of body and soul. It's an integral part moving toward the resurrection for the redemption of man. That's how they see it. Well, angels, you can't do that. They're pure intelligences. They're simple spirits. So if they become corrupt, they're corrupt, right? And that's the majority report. But then you look and you dig around and you find exceptions, right? And so St. Isaac the Syrian, he thinks that angels can be redeemed and will be, and demons will be more grateful than others because they know what it's like to live outside of the light of God. Very controversial, right? Then you see other people like Nemesius of Emesa who thought the angels could be redeemed for a season, but that window has already closed. So any who, are still, demonic and, opposed to God, they can't be redeemed. Somebody like Elder Paisios, more modern saint, you start to see that he tends to think that it's not that they can't be redeemed, but they won't be redeemed. So he roots it in their will. And then you have other people like Pseudo Dionysius who create gray area because they're like he basically says when you talk about sort of metaphysical development or ontological development of a thing, it reaches a point of stasis or rest when it reaches its telos, right? If I'm moving points on a circle out to try to get it to be a perfect circle, when they're all in equal distance from the center, now it's at a point of stasis and rest. Well, in terms of moving them away from the center and messing up the circle, there's an infinite variety and there is no point of rest because you're not moving toward an imperfect circle, right? There's nothing. And so Pseudo Dionysius makes that point in order to say that corruption by its very nature can't be permanent or reach stability, which then opens up the door, because he's talking about in the context of angels, opens up the door that angels could be redeemed. Okay, so you see this spectrum, right? They could be redeemed, but maybe they won't be redeemed. Maybe that's rooted in their will. Maybe it's because there was a season and that's closed. Or maybe they will be redeemed, or maybe they can't be redeemed because they're simple. But what's interesting is when you look at this, you see several continuities with things that they all agree on. So the simplicity argument about angels is rooted in a common understanding of the gospel, what the nature of corruption of man is, the unmaking and the remaking of man is. When you and then that's where the simplicity argument goes off there. And then the contrary, like Pseudo Dionysius, becomes a counterpoint that says, well, no, 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 even if they're simple, you can't have a point of stasis. So they're disputing metaphysical undercurrents. But what's interesting about it is that none of the Eastern Fathers say that the angels can be redeemed, but God's unwilling. And so, what's intriguing about the discussion is the discussion itself reveals to you that one of the things that's consistent for the Eastern Fathers is they understand God's goodness and his providence to mean that he wills the good of a creature no matter what. That's a singular movement toward all of creation. And so, if the angels are not to be redeemed, then there has to be an explanation for why they can't be redeemed. And that's where you see the continuity. So John of Damascus and St. Isaac the Syrian could agree that God is good and provident and wills the good of his creatures, including the fallen angels, and is willing to redeem them. But John thinks it's metaphysically impossible. And St. Isaac the Syrian thinks that it is metaphysically possible and will happen. But there is still a certain commonality. And that commonality goes to some of those root convictions that are there in that core that I talked about their understanding of God and the gospel and things like that. And so when I look through the Eastern Fathers, that's what I really see. And so that's where I think it's entirely possible to talk about this core orthodoxy in terms of the underlying understanding of the doctrine of God, Christology, Mary, icons, and the gospel, which is all an interconnecting puzzle that's there. And I think it's possible to trace the contours of that out into the varieties that are there. And when you do that, you can start to see how there is harmony between the differences. And you can also see where the boundary lines are, like what's not allowed when you've crossed over into an impermissible, position that is heresy. And so that's really what I see when you're looking at the varieties in Orthodoxy. I think that's what you're really looking at in the Church Fathers, in the Eastern Church Fathers. But I think what you're looking at in contemporary culture is just scattershot, a whole host of different voices that don't necessarily see that, and a host of unintended syncretisms. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to sort of cut through all that noise and then come back to saying, well, what really is the sort of core if you're talking about the Eastern view, and you're talking about various theological opinions and variety and things like that. As well as then we could also talk about the ways just in which culturally it begins to develop, and there's a different flavor to orthodoxy across different cultures and so on. But I've gone on long enough here, Paul. So I think that's sort of that's my.
I like listening to you. That's why I know how you talk, but I very much appreciate how you talk. That's why we do this. It's why you have your own podcast. It's why people, if you like this, there's lots more of it,
There
and
is.
more coming.
It's
I,
fun.
I think part of where people struggle is that, for example, I have another friend who is grew up in, oh, he's been all over the map. He grew up in a restorationist tradition, Christian church, Disciples of Christ. He was with the Buddhists for a long time, had an experience that sent him back to Christianity, sent him to then just via family relations went back to Christian church, Disciple of Christ church, but that locally that sort of went off the rails, and so he's now considering Catholicism, and I think part of the attraction for him is he might look at what you've just described and say, you know what, I'm not Nathan Jacobs. I do not have I can't read as much as he has read. I don't have enough time in my life to read what he's read.
Mhm.
I'm not as smart as he is. I'm not as articulated as he is. What attracts me to Rome is the promise. And now a whole bunch of us hear that and are like, yeah, we get the promise. We get the promise. But the promise that um, wiser, I mean, it's the flip side of consumerism. On
Mhm.
one hand, it's Android and Apple. On one hand, I like an Android phone because whether or not I actually sideload anything, I want to know that Google is, I can put something on my phone that Google maybe doesn't want me to.
Mhm. Right.
I'm in charge of my phone, and with Android, it's mix and match, and if I've got enough text, if I've got enough tech chops, I can do that. Same thing with Windows. I build my own machines. I can put Linux on if I want to. I can do all this stuff because, but the majority of people want Apple because the Apple engineers, they're thinking for you. They know what's best. And
Mhm.
so all I want to know is that it just works. And so I think for many people, the promise of Rome is, oh, I can't hope to somehow get in my little mind the summation of 2,000 years of Christianity.
Hmm.
So why don't I just turn it over to Rome and do what they say? And I actually see that also happening with Orthodoxy
Sure.
because
Yeah.
part of the ethos of Protestantism is obviously the protest, the rebellion.
Right.
Why am I going to listen to what some stinking pope says? Martin Luther is in a sense, and in fairness to Martin, you know, he was in kind of a tough spot, and I think that actually, in some ways, Martin would have appreciated maybe the end that Jan Hus had, where but, Martin's elector looks at Martin as like, I don't know if I want my publishing star to necessarily get burned in the flames. So I'm going to lock him in a castle. So,
Uh-huh.
Martin, you don't actually get to choose what you want. You just stay in that castle. Just keep volcanoing as long as it's coming through, and we'll keep the printing presses going. This messy Reformation. Um, and so the promise of Rome is just it's Apple
Right.
supposedly, ideally, of course, and a lot of us will look at Rome, it's like, Steve Jobs was a petty tyrant, and tyrannies have their own blessings.
Hmm.
And some might look at Apple and say, it's not the Apple it used to be. Have you seen how many SKUs they have? There should be one iPhone. It should have no buttons and no ports, and it should be one seamless, pure thing. But I see many now going to Orthodoxy very much out of what you just laid through and say, I just want to offload. The world is too complex,
Hmm.
and the internet is part of the problem.
Hmm.
So I just want a priest who's going to tell me what to do, tell me right from wrong, tell me when I need to go to church, tell me what I can eat and can't eat at certain periods. And of course, in some ways, we wandered in a little bit to the question of culture
Yeah.
because culture is sort of this in-between space. You can talk about discerning this core of orthodoxy, but
Hmm.
obviously through the patchwork of ethnicities and people groups that is Eastern Europe, which was sort of walled off from us for a considerable amount of our lifetimes, or at least if you're old enough.
Hmm.
Um, why, if orthodoxy has offers this promise, why isn't there an Orthodox Pope?
Yeah. So on the one hand, what I want to say is I think there's something valid about the idea of saying like, look, I don't want to have the burden of learning the entire history of ideas and figuring it out.
Nor am I capable of it.
Or nor am I capable, right? And this is actually one of the things that I think was always laughable about the Enlightenment, right? You read Kant's What is Enlightenment, and you sort of scrutinize this you scrutinize this concept of enlightenment. And you're like, really? I'm supposed to learn as much about medicine. I'm supposed to learn enough about medicine to be able to scrutinize a medical expert's judgments for myself, right? And it just seems implausible. Like, how am I supposed? And obviously, we have a certain hubris with regard to, well, I Googled it, right? And the internet. And of course, that's the nightmare of so many experts. And AI is even worse, right? Like the now AI just comes in and is like the new expert and all this sort of stuff. But the thing is, people who are real experts know that it's just not reliable, right? You can sit here and pull up, whatever AI device is going to tell you about different stuff in petrology, and I'll tell you where it's all bunk, and so it's not really reliable. And so even with those sorts of technologies that maybe expand our confidence to do those sorts of things, it's still just not plausible. There's not enough hours in the day. And so it does seem like a fool's errand to begin with, to start there. I think that's true with the Enlightenment generally. And so when I look at that, I look at there is validity to the idea of saying, I talked to an expert in this topic, put aside religion, right? Like I can sit here and have a conversation with an expert in, I don't know, geology, right? Like pick whatever discipline you want. And I can ask them questions, but I'm just going to have to put a tacit trust in them as I'm going through this that they know what they're talking about because they devoted their life to it and they studied it and I didn't, right? And I think there's wisdom in that, and obviously it's wisdom. It's the wisdom that's there that, every time a child hopes that their parents are a reliable guide in the world, it's the wisdom that's there in that. And so I think there's something perfectly suitable and actually wise about the idea that says, look, I can't sort through this stuff, nor do I want to, nor am I capable. I'm going to defer to some authority over me, and they'll just tell me how to live. Okay. And so I look at that and I think there's something valid about that. I also think that there's something valid about approaching religion that isn't through the head, right? And this is one of the things when I was talking about how North America is different, because we're products of the Enlightenment. It's, outside of the United States and, North America generally, and maybe some aspects of Europe, right? Like it's not like it's completely isolated to the United, to the United States or wherever. You do have this tendency to approach religion through practice, right? You go into India, right, and you start to talk to Hindus about their religion, you're not going to find a systematic theology there. It's a lived and fleshed religion.
Yeah.
And so when you look at how religion is practiced in the world generally, the sort of Enlightenment approach that is trying to build from first principles and a priori and proofs for God and all this sort of stuff is a very late development, very new way of approaching religion. And so I think when you look at that, the idea that a person can go into religion and have, well, since you brought up Luther, right? Like, what is the phrase, like implicit faith or something like that when you're talking about an infant's, right? This is, of course, the question, if you need to have faith in order to be saved, why would you do infant baptism for the Lutherans? And this idea of implicit faith, that an infant has a trust in whatever their parents believe, was how they sort of, the Lutherans tried to make sense of that issue. And I think again, there's something valid about that. There's something if you go and you talk to the little babushka, in Greece, who and you start to ask her theology questions about Orthodoxy, and she's like, whatever the church says, right? She implicitly believes whatever the church believes.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that is perfectly valid. And I think the validity of that actually is enhanced by the ontological approach to religion, the way of thinking about religion in an ontological sense. I think one of the challenges is that within Protestantism and specifically anti-sacramentalist Protestant traditions, once you go into the idea that the sacraments don't actually do anything, which obviously is in all Protestant traditions, but those particular sort of radical Reformation, anti-sacramentalist traditions, you start to naturally turn religion into worldview, right? I am saved by mentally assenting to a certain or conceding a certain claim. Jesus died for my sins. And I better understand it rightly because that's also really important for my salvation. Because if I think my works contribute, then I'm a Pelagian, and that could be detrimental to my salvation, and so on. And all of a sudden, religion becomes cognitive, becomes purely cognitive, and in some ways disembodied. Disembodied because there's nothing out there in terms of sacraments that are going to do anything to me or for me. There's also an invisible church, so this is about me and God. And so you have this purely disembodied religion, and a disembodied religion that elevates the role of the mind and what I believe and think. In the role of not just the religion, but in my salvation, my very salvation itself. But If you have a more ontological view of Christianity, the idea that the sacraments do something, right? That there is a visible church, that visible church is a hospital. I can enter into that even if I'm an infant who doesn't understand what's happening and be affected by that and in some ways commune with that. I can, as I grow up, still not understanding things, still experience the ontological realities of that. And of course, in Orthodoxy, then the primary concern is the disposition of the heart, repentance, and things like that. And so I can still have that penitent, humble approach to it, even if I don't understand theologically what's going on. I have no idea about metaphysics or whatever. Uh, I think that provides an additional layer of validity when you start to think ontologically about the effects of religion, about what it is, that it is a visible thing that actually has sacramental medicine to give to you. So once you have that, I think you have the approach to religion that is largely ontological. It is relational. It's me moving into a temple, dealing with a deity. There are rituals by which I interact with that deity, whatever it is. Um, when you think about religion that way, it makes sense that outside of the Enlightenment, you would end up having religion primarily be something that is lived. And yes, of course, you have scholars and philosophers and, like sages and whatever it might be who know the sort of ins and outs of it. But for the average person, the faith is something that's lived. It's something that you just go and you do, and you have a basic trust in, the efficacious nature of this, and the love and providence of God or whatever it might be. And so when I look at that, I think there's something, quite valid about that sort of approach. I don't think the promise when you're talking about that sort of thing is relegated to Rome. Obviously, Rome, you do have the advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you're looking at it, of that singularity. Um, and yet within Orthodoxy, if and again, this is where I think there's something, I there's something almost quasi-enlightenment about the promise within Rome, right? Because if what you're looking for is Rome is going to tell me what I think about this politically, or about, it's going to tell me what I think about this theologically or whatever else, it's still primarily up here, right, in terms of the head. Whereas within Orthodoxy, I think, and I think this is one of the things that appeals to a lot of people about it. Um, for a lot of Protestants, they felt like my religion, well, I'll just speak for myself, right? So I was raised in a Lutheran tradition. My mom was Missouri Synod Lutheran, my dad was nothing, right? And so, from a Lutheran perspective, as I was raised, I had this very simplified gospel. Jesus died for your sins. You should believe that if you believe that. If you died tonight and God asks you, why should I let you into heaven? This is what you say, and you're good to go. And I also had the sense that good works are the enemy of, my soul. And if you think, we don't even know if the Catholics are saved because, they think they have to do good works and so on.
Semi-Pelagian.
Yep, that's right. There it is. And so a lot of like myself, and I've found from conversations with others that this was not unique to me. You find yourself going, so what do I do now? Right? Okay, so I know the secret password to get into heaven. Um, does it matter how I live? And it becomes difficult when you start to say like, yes, and everything you do is, is sin, and you can't do anything to, become any more holy than you are because, it's all sin, and don't think that your good works are gonna, those could be detrimental to you. You end up oftentimes running into these patterns of thoughts that say like, what do I do? Right? Like, what do I do? Because like I guess I'm supposed to do good works, but I have to make sure I do them out of gratitude. And if I'm not really grateful, do I do them? Right? Because then I might be doing them out of attempt to earn God's favor. And I think there's a lot of folks who oftentimes, I think this is one of the reasons why in certain circles like evangelicalism, the lived faith becomes just apologetics because it's kind of a
Mm.
pyramid scheme. I'm in, so now the only thing, and now that I'm in, like I'm good, right? I'm saved, and so the thing I should be doing is trying to get other people in, and that's where it just becomes I'm going to try to convince you and convert you, and that becomes the sort of the way you live it out. And I think for a lot of Protestants, because of the sort of head nature of it, they oftentimes find themselves with this disconnected, how do I live, right?
Yeah.
What is the fleshed nature of this? Whereas in within the Eastern Fathers and Orthodoxy, I think there's a more natural tendency to emphasize the lived aspect of it, right? Because once you understand what it's saying, it's really telling you you should be focusing on prayer, you should be focusing on fasting, you should be putting to death the passions, these sorts of things. And so the practical ramifications of what it's articulating ends up having that as the deliverance of how do you live. It's a very clear answer how you live. And also, because there's a resistance to the idea that true knowledge of God is really in the sort of propositional understanding of God, but it's something that's also supposed to be, something that is a participatory experience of God. Again, it sort of pushes you to not get stuck in the rut of talking about God, but sort of entering into this. And so I think that's one of the things where there's a certain amount of advantage there amongst the people who are not just saying, what do I believe about certain things? They're asking, how am I supposed to construct my life and live day to
Right.
day? Um, and so I think there is a promise of that within Orthodoxy. So even though in Orthodoxy, you can look to the Church Fathers and the Ecumenical Council and the Orthodox Church on certain doctrinal stuff, they're not going to sit there and tell you what you should think, have our latest, encyclical or whatever it might be on, on this social topic or something like that. They're not really going to offer you that sort of, guidance that you might get in a Roman Catholic context. But in terms of the putting aside politics and how do I personally live and work out my salvation, they do have plenty to offer in terms of that. And so when I look at that, I think with regard to Orthodoxy, you do have those promises, right? Those promises that says this is a place where you'll be told how to live day to day. Um, and this is a place where you can set aside the task of having to figure out every single thing and just have an implicit faith because the faith is lived and ontological. Now, whether many people do that in North America, I think there's a lot more people who would, the temptation for them is to continue to just consume information and not actually live it, right? That's always a danger within our own context. But I think it's the good news is it's an acknowledged danger that is warned against. Like you really shouldn't do that, right? Because at the end of the day, living this is the more important thing. Now, in terms of like, then why do you not have a singularity in terms of like the Pope and things like that? Perhaps one of the best metaphors I can come up with. I mean, I don't know if it's the best metaphor. It's a useful metaphor within our current context. It's almost a more libertarian way of thinking about ecclesiology, where the idea is that says like, yeah, we have certain, like we'll call them federal level things that are there, which have to do with the church fathers and the ecumenical councils. But there's always been a respect for the fact that then there are these, episcopal jurisdictions that are responsible for their own people and for their own, day-to-day stuff and the own, their shepherding of those sorts of folks. And that's in some ways been, on the one hand, I know people like David Bradshaw, for example, will say quite candidly, like, well, if you don't like organized religion, then you'll love Orthodoxy because we surely cannot be accused of being organized. Uh, and it's true. Like you look at Orthodoxy, how you move toward autocephalous, where you have like a jurisdiction that has now sort of been released from its broader jurisdiction and it has a certain level of autonomy in a region. There's not really a good formal process. You can descriptively talk about how it comes about, but it is really a sort of organic, over the span of time process. And so the thing is, within Orthodoxy, there is a certain messiness to this. There's a certain messiness about jurisdictions. There's a certain messiness about um, you know how certain aspects of that jurisdictional authority and sort of lived aspect of the faith will work its way out. And you could pick up like, Timothy Ware's or Callistos Ware's, Metropolitan Callistos Ware's church or the Orthodox Church, right? Which is good history of the Orthodox Church, and you'll see the messiness of a lot of that sort of stuff there. And so what's interesting is oftentimes, again, like within our context, where we like to abstract principles, we will look at the description and say, so that's the principle of how it's done. And it's like, no, that's more descriptive than prescriptive. It's how it happened, right? But it's not as if there is a formalized process for doing some of these things. And that is, on the one hand, you can look at it as a weakness and be critical of it because there are certain times in history where that gets really messy, right? And yet at the same time, I think it's the very thing that has, in many ways, obviously, I would also attribute providence, but in many ways, I think in terms of mechanistic, if I'm going to offer a mechanism, historical mechanism, it's one of the things that's allowed Orthodoxy to remain so consistent because the process of formalizing a heresy is so difficult and so murky
Hmm.
and so long that more likely than not, the heretic is going to die out before it could ever take root. And so there's a certain irony, and this is why I use the libertarian analogy, right? Part of the wisdom of the libertarian is you have all of the, like at least early libertarian, I'm not talking about like contemporary libertarian, but like states' rights libertarian, the original concept, where you have these certain sovereign territories where they can do experimental things and you can
Yeah.
run your state into the ground, but at least you don't drag the rest of us down with us and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's a certain level of autonomy there. Part of the wisdom of that was that you allowed that organic process to take place where there are certain non-negotiables that we're on the same page about, but on this sort of lower jurisdictional level, there's a certain organic, autonomy that's there. Where we don't cross over into each other's territory, and that's going to be a messy process where certain things are successful and certain things are not. And I think in some ways the jurisdictional approach of Orthodoxy, where you have all of these different jurisdictions that are in communion, but they're under different sort of episcopal authorities, ends up creating that same sort of messiness that means that there are times where you see trends, you see heresies, you see things that are divergent from the faith and or are some form of syncretism. And these are oftentimes identified, right? These Western captivity of the church is something that like certain folks like Losky and Florovsky and Schmemann will talk about, right? Where there's certain syncretisms that are taking place. Um, they'll take hold for a season, but because it's very difficult because you don't have that singularity, like a pope who just makes it so, it's very difficult for that to metastasize and spread throughout the entire Orthodox Church. And you see time and time again in history where that will start to die out and course correct. And I think that's one of the things that you see even in the first millennium. If you look at the disposition of like the Cappadocians during these sort of like Arian, semi-Arian controversies, like they're worried, they're like, yeah, the church is going to collapse. Nobody practices the true faith anymore. Like you'll find these very cynical things
Hmm.
that before things course correct. And it's like in the providence of God, okay, this heresy was put down and things course corrected. But I mean, if you're Maximus the Confessor, and you're looking at how many of the pontiffs have come around to heresy and how many you're up against, and your tongue's been ripped out and your hand's been cut off, you're going to be pretty cynical about the future of the church at that point. And that happens time and time and time again.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think within Orthodoxy, as uncomfortable as this answer is, because I've had people ask, like, because they're looking for the formula.
Yeah.
How many popes and priests do you need to get an infallible council together? They're like looking for some sort of, human formula that we can control. And Orthodoxy has a much more organic acceptance of the providence of God, where there is not a formula. Like there's not a formula that makes the ecumenical councils what they are. They're seen as I mean, you could look at Florovsky on this and his essay on the seven ecumenical councils. He identifies them as essentially charismatic in nature, that what they're seen as is these moments in which, the church came together, the providence of God course corrected something, and that was received and embraced by the church and became part of its dogma, which that term, according to Basil of Caesarea, means the lived faith of the church. It's not a dogmatic treatise or something like that. Dogma for Basil means the lived faith of the church. And so it becomes incorporated in that. And that's part of what the Orthodox tend to see as, well, this is Christ fulfilling his promise to lead, the church into all truth and all that. And that makes a lot of people who want a nice systematic approach really uncomfortable,
Yeah.
you know. And yet that's the reality of it, right? Like there's no getting around. No, if you try to create a prescriptive formula for this is how it works, you will be doing something anachronistic that is not really true to the Orthodox world. Now, I'll just say one more thing before I kick it back to you. Um, I think one of the bigger questions within that, once you acknowledge that, is the question of how do I conduct myself within a body that's like that. So if I were to embrace this view, right, that the Orthodox Church is a living organism, right, that's spread throughout space and time, and I think that there's a cancer in it at some point. How do I how do I conduct myself, right? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that I think the Orthodox view of the church ends up accounting for schisms while also offering an answer to that question,
Hmm.
right? So within Orthodoxy, for example, you'll see that how converts are received from other traditions varies depending on the tradition. And and there's a sense in which the variation depends on how far from the body has this schism strayed, right? So like Mormonism, for example, was never part of the body. It's not a defector, right? It's a completely alien theology. And so it's treated as such, right? There's nothing, remedial to be done here because there's nothing that's been done that's valid from the start. Whereas, in Catholicism, it's still seen as schismatic, but you wouldn't rebaptize because you've been baptized and you've been baptized by something that is schismatic. And so we can bring you back in and sort of repair that, but you're already been baptized. And I think this is one of the things where I think the analogy of the body or the hypostasis, right? Not so much the body, but the hypostasis doctrine within the Eastern Fathers is helpful. Because I was talking to somebody about this very point of schisms, is that if you have the concept of the hypostasis, which in the Eastern Fathers is this concept that develops around the initially around the Trinity discussion amongst the Cappadocians and then becomes central to how they talk about Christology, is the idea of the enduring subject, right? The one who actually has a body, who has human nature, and so on. And so there was this acknowledgement that the subject or the individual is not just a cluster phenomenon, right? It's not just that you get a bunch of idiosyncratic properties and that's what makes me me. It's not something like that. It's its own sort of ontological reality that's underneath it and has those things. Well, what that starts to offer you is it starts to address certain faulty ways of thinking, um, and account for certain other more common sense ways of thinking. What I have in mind here is something like if, somebody came in and they chopped off my hand and they threw it across the room, right? I would be like, my hand, right? And if somebody like took it, I'd be like, that's my hand. So the intuitive common sense tendency is to say that that somehow belongs to me. And yet a pure materialist proximity view makes that really difficult to account for because the materialist tends to think of that as mine because it's attached to me. And so this is where somebody like David Hume would point out, I'm just appealing to memory. It's just that I have a memory of it being attached to me, but in reality, it's not attached to me anymore, so it's not mine anymore. Whereas I think the problem is that way of thinking about it seems to violate what our common sense intuition is, that it really is mine, right? That is mine, even though it's been severed from me. And this comes through in the church fathers, right? The reason that the body of the saint is still the saint's body is for this very reason, that it is not a pure proximity view. And I think if you're thinking about the church as a body, right, since this is, the Pauline metaphor that we're given in the first place, that grows across space and time and spreads. And let's say you take the Orthodox position and you think like that the Orthodox tradition is the Orthodox Church is that body and it's sort of the core enduring body. But you think of Rome as a severed arm, right? That's been like there's a schism here. And so there's a break. Does that mean it's not part of the body? The answer is like, no, it still belongs to the body. What makes it a schism as opposed to a totally different thing is that it belongs to that body, but it has been severed from it. And then that's why Protestant traditions that are broken away from that are schisms from that. So this is a finger that we cut off of that, off of that arm or something like that. And I think that way of thinking about it helps account for how the Orthodox Church tends to treat these things.
Hmm.
The fact that you wouldn't rebaptize a Lutheran, you wouldn't rebaptize a Catholic, but you would baptize like a oneness Pentecostal who isn't a Protestant. This isn't a schismatic tradition, right? Like this is just sort of its own invented ex nihilo tradition that's also non-Trinitarian and so on and so forth, or Mormonism or something like that.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things, I think, start to account for that. And once you start to think like that, then you start to recognize that how I begin to approach a question of heresy or something like that, if I think the church has gone wrong, on the one hand, there is a submission to the broader authority, right? That's there. Of course, you really should, like I'm always one of the things that I worry about is when Protestants come into the Orthodox Church, they still think like Protestants, where I'm still assessing the authorities and I will submit to you only so far as I think you're right, that sort of thing. And there still isn't this sort of acknowledgement of a submission to authority. And one of the things that sometimes will happen in that context is you start to have people emerge who are more Orthodox than the Orthodox, right? Where they're sitting there and saying, no, 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 the true Orthodox faith is this, and the Orthodox Church is divergent from it, and they want to create basically like some sort of Protestant movement where we're going to rally and get the Orthodox Church to change its view or something like that, which is a really dangerous thing because it's a very, I mean, you're not really submitting to the Orthodox Church at that point. But that naturally does raise the question of, but what if they were wrong about something? Like, because basically in the account that I've given, and just like at the account in church history, you have hierarchs go wrong. Some of our chief heretics were patriarchates, right? Like Nestorius, he's a chief heretic, right? He was the patriarchate of Constantinople. And so you look at it and it's like, yeah, there's no trust that just because somebody's a bishop means that they're right within the Orthodox Church. And so once you account for that, like, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right? Like, what do you do if you disagree? And I think one of the things that I've seen practically is that the only way in which to voice that in an Orthodox fashion, as opposed to in more of an Enlightenment fashion or a Protestant fashion, is that you voice it from within the church. So I know that there are certain people who disagree, and I disagree with them, but I know that there are certain people who think that the Orthodox Church is wrong to receive certain converts by chrismation rather than baptism. And I think you should be giving Orthodox baptisms to everybody.
Yep.
I think that's incorrect, patristically speaking. And I think it's also incorrect because I trust the decision of the church on this. And anyway, I could go through that whole thing, but I won't here because it's a little far afield. But
You probably have do you have a YouTube on it?
I don't.
Oh,
Uh,
put that on your
Maybe I
list.
should.
Because it's one that because again, I'm talking to a fair amount of people, and
Yeah.
so then I'll ask them simple questions like, okay, you joined the Orthodox Church. Did they insist on you being rebaptized? And then I can ask them, what church were you baptized before? And so, in the Matrix, I know, was
Yep.
it a Trinitarian baptism or not?
Yep. Yep.
In the Christian Reformed Church, part of what strikes me in this is the role of modern structures.
Hmm.
So the video that I released this morning, I talked about the fact that one of the differences between the ancient and the medieval world were that you really didn't have compliance structures or capacity with the kind of granularity that we assume from our modern structures.
Hmm.
So, for the probably most extreme example, if the People's Republic of China, keeps a social credit score on you,
Hmm.
it's on you.
Right.
Whereas if you're in a medieval or an ancient system, um, there's the capacities for compliance and enforcing compliance were radically different. Even if you had fairly black and white lines that the head was declaring, and so again, part of what I've seen in the Orthodox Church has been this question of you were chrismated, you were rebaptized, you were rebaptized, you were chrismated, and I'm watching this, and in some ways, it's Ross Douthat and Bishop Barron had a conversation about basically Catholicism in the internet age, and
Hmm.
part of what the internet facilitates is that in a way I go out and can have personal relationships with a dozen people that I never would have known
Hmm.
apart from this crazy thing called the internet. And now we can compare notes.
Hmm.
And what that tends to do is contribute to the participation of this control cycle. I mean, Kings North would call it the machine. Now
Hmm.
suddenly, whereas the the idiosyncratic elements of Orthodox churches in medieval or ancient or pre-modern societies, you would have to travel. But the
Hmm.
percentage of people who actually traveled was pretty tiny. And of course, to a degree, the printing press afforded this because suddenly Luther's ideas wouldn't just be limited to his students at Wittenberg.
Hmm.
Suddenly, Luther's ideas are just going through the Holy Roman Empire. And there's
Right.
a whole bunch of other motivations that the various principalities have with respect to the fundraising that is happening in Rome. And so, part of me is watching this next wave because it's not the first wave
Hmm.
of Orthodoxy sort of coming to America.
Hmm.
This is obviously a pretty significant wave, and it's going to be very interesting to me how the last conversation I had, I used this word metagelical. How not only are people coming into the Orthodox Church from various Protestants, and there's no sort of cutting out people. I mean, we grow and are formed, and I very much appreciate the um, the posture that you just articulated in terms of a great amount of trust in God's providence and a
Hmm.
willingness to let to trust God through the inscrutable messiness and complexity that every human being, and in fact, the multiplication of these human beings are in the world.
Hmm.
Um, and so I like and welcome the the participation of Orthodoxy in North America, and I think it already has been. I think it's going to continue to bless churches across the board because this has tended to be how American religion works.
Hmm.
Because again, America tends to be founded by English nonconformists
Right.
who, wanted to get out of there for a whole variety of reasons. And now suddenly they have an opportunity to construct their own, little utopia. And of course, the Mormons are in some ways the great example of this. I mean,
Right.
they just kept moving west. And if you look at what their original Mormon state was, is this massive part of the West, which of course they couldn't hold on to because they had to deal with Uncle Sam. So, and of course the Catholics coming to America and in the United States, the way that, Catholicism had to deal with things and the way that America changed Catholicism, especially because of Catholicism's fall in the old world,
Hmm.
because you can look at, finally the Pope becoming the prisoner of Rome and Italian unification, the loss of huge chunks of Europe to Protestant principalities, the unique character that, Gallicanism versus Ultramontanism in Vatican I.
Hmm.
I mean, you just have this astoundingly messy process. And now, of course, the fall of the Iron Curtain, the the diaspora of Orthodoxy, and the challenges of Orthodoxy that many of its YouTube clerics will admit to, which is, if you look at part of the reason why the Methodists and the Baptists were so successful in the Second Great Awakening in American church history is because they could multiply clergy fast. And you get to be a pastor, and you get to be a pastor, and you get to be a pastor.
Uh-huh.
And Orthodoxy is like, no, it's not going to be that way here.
No, 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 no.
So it's very interesting to me watching all of this happen, and very much appreciating the long-term view that I've not only heard from some Orthodox, but I see in their way, because part of my realization about Protestants is that in many ways they're not anywhere near as Protestant as they like to think they are and that they try to express. There are deep things that even Protestantism couldn't fully exorcise from the church, and to pastor a church and actually know, well, our official policies are these, and these, but the flock, boy, there's only so much that they'll actually absorb of those things. And in fact, these very ancient practices that churches continue to um, express, sometimes they're covered up by the particularities of a particular Protestant confessional system. And then you watch, part of what happens in America is this grand swirl of lay people absorbing from each other. And
Hmm.
that then will get expressed in churches, and that then will sort of creep up the hierarchies, just because there's no resisting it. So
Well, and I think that goes to when I was talking about how do you, within an Orthodox context, begin to address things that, in a non-Protestant way from within the body. And I think what you're talking about, that the sort of all these different things coming into a body and sort of trickling their way up to the hierarchy, uh, I I think that really is kind of the Orthodox way, that you do it from within the body. And from within the body, I don't mean that you start a coup or a church within a church or anything like that. I'll give you an example, a tangible example, since I was bringing up the baptism thing, right? Because one of the problems with the baptism thing is it's not just that certain people disagree with it. It's then because they well, and I won't even say, I think many of them, it's not even that they disagree with it. For some of them, it's almost like this neurotic worry that maybe I'm not really saved, right? If I haven't had an Orthodox baptism, and they sort of get into this, the deficiency of my salvation or something like that,
yeah,
which
and
is,
sheep lie. When you're talking to people who've come in, they do.
yeah, yeah.
Because
And
some of them, they were Baptist and they really want another baptism.
that's right. And that's another thing, right? So when you talk about low resolution, right? The articulated thing is, I don't know if we should be receiving people by chrismation rather than baptizing. But then there's all these low resolution things like, but I really want to get an Orthodox baptism, or or things like I'm worried that I'm going to be damned if I don't have an Orthodox baptism, and it's like what, like there's all these sorts of things like that. But and so the result is that sometimes you actually have people go off and get like a secret baptism because their church won't do it. And that's the thing, right? Like that's the
Oh
thing.
yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, and the thing is, like when I was in a conversation with, I've had plenty of conversations, but one of the conversations that comes to mind is that somebody was talking about this and they had done a secret baptism, right? And they were basically pressing like, what do you do? Like, what do you do if you think the church has gone astray? I mean, the church has gone astray in the past, right, Arianism started taking root. And so if a certain jurisdiction should be baptizing people, but they're not, what do you do? And I gave my whole theological reasons why I thought the worry was wrong-headed in the first place. But the thing that I encouraged them to do is I said, if you are really convinced that not baptizing converts from, and this person was a former Catholic, right? Not baptizing Catholic converts is on par with Arianism, such that the church is in danger of forfeiting the faith, once given over to the saints. I was like, then do what Athanasius did. Athanasius didn't hide his disagreement with Arianism. He voiced it and accepted exile for it.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, he protested from within the church, meaning acknowledging his role as a deacon and accepting the consequences from the hierarchs of his protest. That would be a sort of non-Protestant, non-Enlightenment way of protesting. So, with this person, I said, what you should do, if you really believe that, is go tell your priest you had a secret baptism and accept the consequences. And that's what he did. Right? Like, and the consequences is what he was disciplined, right?
Yeah.
For doing it. And I said, okay, there you go. Like that, if you want to, sort of voice your concern. Now, I think also the other thing with it, and this would be a very orthodox way of thinking, is saying, you should be very suspicious of your own spiritual maturity and discernment and not think yourself to be Athanasius. Having just converted to Orthodoxy, you should probably spend some time, mastering asceticism and prayer and things like that before you have such strong convictions about, about whether or not the church has gone astray in this sort of prescription and so on. But I think that does go into this all gets to that root of when all of these different things are coming in, right? And they can be things that are coming in from the internet. They can be things that's just baggage that's being carried in from I'm a former Protestant, or they can be baggage that just comes from the fact that we're in a post-Enlightenment context. Some of it is actually just misunderstandings, right? Like, so some of it is that the thing said on the internet isn't wrong, but how it's heard is misguided, and that gets carried in, right? So you have all of this sort of stuff trickling in. And if everybody just had an implicit faith, it probably wouldn't be that dangerous. I mean, it would just mean like a bunch of people have wacky ideas if you talk to them, but like none of them are, preaching it or, disseminating it. They're all just going to church and doing the things they're supposed to do in terms of prayer and fasting and liturgy and all the rest. It would probably be more benign in that case. But in our context, which is a context that tends to flow on an economy of ideas and words and opinions, and you need to have an opinion, right? You need to have an opinion about this political issue. You need to have an opinion about this theological issue. Since that's sort of the currency we run in, that's where those things start to have more fuel to them in ecclesial context, here in North America. And so, and I think in that sense, there is a real need. And I guess this goes back to I see several needs, right? Like one of the needs that's there is to have that sort of gear shift away from a religion of ideas to a lived, if you're really going to be Orthodox, right? It needs to be an ontologically lived faith. And there has to be that sort of gear shift. There has to be that gear shift where there genuinely is a movement into a submission to the Orthodox Church. And that doesn't mean, as I said, that doesn't mean that the Orthodox Church can never have bad bishops or hierarchs or whatever. But it does mean that there is a different way of approaching that from within the church than it would be if you're just an outside, scrutinizer of ideas or something like that. And so there's that. And that sort of lived and that lived faith, and then the sort of learning to live within it and how to process those things. And then also with it, like I said, I think there's just a need for a certain amount of self-awareness. And that's where the whole East-West series that I was doing or that I am doing is largely about that. Knowing that I don't think I'm going to get anybody, like I don't think anybody here in North America is going to turn off their Enlightenment brain or post-Enlightenment brain. Like that's just not going to happen. Um, and just as an aside here, I'll say I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? I think sometimes when people will hear me acknowledge that there's something weird about a sort of our sort of post-Enlightenment context and the way we approach religion means that that's bad and you shouldn't do that. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And this is something I think I talked about the last time we had a conversation where I said the best version of American Orthodoxy is that the fact that we are interested in ideas and philosophy and systematics and whatever it might be ends up becoming a tool that becomes an instrument of a revival of Orthodox apologetics and whatever else. I mean, I look at the church fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, John of Damascus, they're very philosophically sophisticated and systematic in the way they think about it. So that's perfectly compatible with Orthodoxy, even if it's not the whole of its legacy. And so, just like other aspects of the Orthodox faith, Orthodoxy is always lived, right? The same divine liturgy is performed in all the Orthodox churches, but you can tell when you're in an Antiochian church versus a Russian church, because they sound different. You can look at iconography. If you know iconography, you can tell the difference between, Russian iconography and Romanian iconography and whatever it might be. And so, and I think that's perfectly acceptable, right? It's kind of like when you hand Bach to, three different cellists, their technique and their voice is going to come through and how they interpret that and how they play that and all the rest. And I think that's how it's supposed to be. I think inevitably when orthodoxy is lived and embraced by culture, it should still be orthodoxy, right? But of course you should hear the voice of that culture coming through as they sing it, as they live it. And so I don't think that's a bad thing. And so when I look at, American Orthodoxy and what that would look like as it takes root, I expect it will mean that it ends up being a haven or a sort of a wellspring of apologetics and patrology and, systematic thinking and evangelism and things like that, which I think are all good things that would be representative of its idiosyncrasies, as long as it doesn't bring with it the potentially cancerous things that could come with those.
Yeah.
And so I think even the best version of American Orthodoxy would still have all that, right? And so I offer that aside in order to say, like, yes, I don't think that's going to go away. I think that's sort of just baked in at this point in terms of like North American culture. If it's going to embrace Orthodoxy, that's going to be part of the embrace. And that's one of the reasons why I think self-awareness is the better thing, is to be self-aware of both the sort of lenses that we wear, being self-aware about, what our own sort of Western traditions and roots are that shape our thinking and how those contrast with Eastern roots so that there's not unintentional syncretism for those who are engaged in those sorts of ideas. And then the hope is also with that, there's also the cautionary note of our tendency to just sort of intellectualize religion and not live it, And so I think all of those things, the best thing is rather than sort of kicking against, pushing against the grain or something like that and thinking that somehow all of a sudden North American culture is going to completely change, right? To acknowledge that it is what it is and try to do what can be done in order to make it the best version of itself within this context, being mindful of what its flaws are and its pitfalls are, its dangers, and trying to encourage it into that better form. So anyway, I mean that's part of the like I said, it's part of the entire reason I decided to do the East-West series.
When when do you think you're gonna have them done, and where do you think you're gonna put them?
Yeah, so we've been targeting. It's going to be much later in this calendar year, right? So I'm still right now in this development phase. I'm doing sort of the pre-production prep with the production entity that I'm going to be working with, along with scripting them. And it's a lot of scripting. I mean, when you're talking about 25 lecture series an hour a pop, like that's a lot of scripting. And so, I mean, we're definitely talking about probably, I would expect like October might be the earliest that we might see it surface. I don't have an exact like delivery date yet, and that's partially because we're still working out the production schedule. So hopefully I'll have an announcement of an actual release date, soon. But it is this calendar year that it's going to come out. And so in terms of how it's going to be available, I mean, these are basically going to be a video series that, essentially it's going to be, there's been conversations internally about like, do you allow download options? Clearly, there's going to be unlocked streaming options. And we already have those sorts of options through my subscriber platform, right? So there are people who subscribe to, if you go to the nathanjacobspodcast.com, right? That's my podcast, right? The Nathan Jacobs Podcast. You can subscribe to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, and there's different supporter tiers. And within there, you already have things like my lecture series on the Enlightenment, right? And so you can listen to all the different, like it's a 15-part lecture series on modern philosophy. And you can listen to that there. And there's other sort of video content that's there behind a paywall. So we already have a mechanism by which people can unlock behind a paywall and stream online. I think the big question we have is, will we also make a downloadable option, which of course, as you know, is always the challenge of pirating and things like that. So definitely an unlocked streamable option. Whether or not it's downloadable is still a discussion being had behind the scenes on that one. But also my hope, and I don't know, how much the appetite is for this. I'd be curious to know from your perspective, Paul, what the appetite is. But, as I'd said, this isn't an Orthodox apologetic series, right? Like this is supposed to just be a historical series that's
Yeah.
acknowledging that there is an intersection happening worldview wise and culturally between East and West. And this is useful for anybody who's in that discussion, whether they're on the East or the West side. I would really love to see that in the long run, after this is out, even though it's being marketed largely to individuals, I would love to see things like that there are churches that are saying, look, this is a worthy conversation. And so we want to, as a church, buy this and do some sort of a seminar
Yeah.
on it, right? We want to buy access to this and as a church go through this series or go through key things in the series or whatever it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Or even we've already had people reach out who are like, we're 8 guys, right? Who would like to come in at the highest supporter tier, which would give them direct access to Q&As with me.
Yep.
Is it okay if all 8 of us are on the Zoom call and we pool our resources? Which is like, yeah, like I don't like it doesn't make a difference to me whether there's 8 of you on the call or one of you on the call, that sort of thing. But what I like about that is it's opening up something that what I hope is in the long run, I want this to not just be individuals. I'm all for individuals, right? I'm all for individuals who are on this journey and want to know. But I would also like to see more people who are, you know, that there are churches that are maybe using it in their catechesis, or there are churches that are doing seminars, or whatever it is. There are groups that are in some sort of East-West dialogue. I think, for example, Grant Eckhart, a Lutheran pastor that I know, who has been heavily, influenced by me, and we've had a lot of, East-West dialogues. I'd love to see somebody like that facilitate an East-West dialogue. It's been a while since there was the Orthodox Lutheran dialogues, right? You do that sort of thing. I don't know. I see those sorts of possibilities, and I'd love to see more of those emerge in the long run.
Yeah.
Uh, and I don't know. I don't know if the intrigue in Orthodoxy is enough on the sort of ecclesial level to merit that, or if it's largely an individual phenomenon. You would know better than I would, given that you're, within the Reformed tradition outside of the Orthodox Church.
It's part of what's so difficult is that we're living amidst a glut of content.
Yeah.
And so then the question that everyone is sort of competing over is our hierarchies. And I think likely over time, things will emerge, but that those time frames don't necessarily really benefit the creators of that content
Yeah.
because, oh, if I mean, C.S. Lewis sells more books now than
Mhm.
he ever did when he was alive.
Mhm.
And so I think it's helpful. I think that actually encourages Christians because I would hope that most Christians, sure, everybody's got to put bread on the table, and you have to figure out how to, how money and time work together for the demands of your life. But at the same time, I assume that what you're putting together, you would want something like this to really be something that helps people over a long period of time. And of course, we sort of have an understanding, maybe, although it's changing. I was talking to Martin Shaw about this, about the book. What is the status of a book? Now, both of us have obviously paid for plenty of them in our lifetimes,
Right. Yeah.
and continue to read them. So it's part of the question for any of us who are whatever we're doing. I don't really, most of what I do isn't really content creation. My Sunday sermons are a different level from the videos that I make every day that are just
Sure.
kind of off the cuff. Um, so I think it's a challenge for all of us to figure out the sort of the ecosystem that we're in with
Mhm.
respect to, okay, so you're scripting this, it's going to be professionally produced. What is the best way? What is the best way to bless the church with something like this?
Mhm.
It's also, just difficult because part of what the glut of content means is, on one hand, it'd be, wonderful to have a Nathan Jacobs scripted, professionally done, 25-hour series thing.
Mhm.
But a lot of people would say, but I'd rather have Nathan for a weekend in my church to
Uh,
because then it's interactive. For the same way, I hadn't heard of anybody sort of, you know, 8 of us are going to share the one thing, and it's like, oh yeah, that's going to happen.
right.
Um, so now I wish I had an answer for you. I think that's a question, especially in the realm of AI, where obviously some AI bot is going to want to crawl the series. And do I have to really spend 25 hours, or can I just sort of have an LLM Nathan Jacobs and have
Mhm.
it answer my question, which is just terrifying.
It is terrifying.
So I
Yeah.
don't know. I wish I had answers for you, but it's a question that almost anyone who does what we do in terms of podcasts
Mhm.
continues to think about
Yeah.
because I'm in a nice position in which, if I can, if my church sort of makes it to my pension days, I don't rely on what I do on YouTube to a
Mhm.
significant respect to put bread on my table.
Right.
So
Mhm.
so I don't know. I don't know. And I'll be really interested to see how this goes because on one hand, I know there's definitely a nerdy audience out there that will really be looking forward to this,
Yeah.
but whether that nerdy audience is big enough, and then even the more difficult questions of, all right, so this is going to be, you're going to have 25 hours of recordings.
Mhm.
What is the platform that makes it most likely that this will be able to bless the church 50 years from now?
Mhm.
I don't know that we can answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know either. I mean, I mean, one of the natural things in terms of the status of the book and reading and all that, like I do plan to at some point take, of course, the transcripts or the manuscripts, the scripts, and assemble them into a book, right, that can be read. but again, there's also the questions about the truncated version of it, right? I mean, a lot of people might be interested in the distilled version, but 25 hours is too much. And so I do think in the long term, there's all these sorts of questions related to that in terms of posterity. Because you're right, like that is the goal, right? The goal is something that benefits the church in the long run, as opposed to just being a punctuated thing that drops, and that was cool, but you really do want it to be the sort of thing that ends up being something that becomes a resource for orienting the conversation in the long run,
Yeah. Yeah.
and really helping the church, helping dialogue across East and West, helping
Yeah.
people who are navigating these waters and are on spiritual journeys and so on.
Yeah.
And you're right in terms of like the platform and what that looks like going into the future. That's a good question, which I don't have the answer to.
No, I don't think anyone has the answer to in this world. So, and then maybe someone will pirate it and put it on YouTube. Who knows? But the
Uh,
fact is, I mean, YouTube, we think YouTube is sort of the big one right now, but if you've lived any length of time, you know that, the three major networks were
yeah,
inconceivably large at one point, and now what do they matter? So,
right. Yep.
anyway, well, we've been at this for a while, and
Yeah.
I have some sheep to attend to.
Fair enough.
So it was yeah, so you're working on this. Any other things that you need to tell us about?
No, I mean there's the usual stuff. If people like what I have to say, obviously you can go to the Nathan Jacobs podcast. I've got it on hiatus during Lent, and so it'll resurface with new episodes toward the end of April. But I decided to take Lent and Bright Week off, and so I actually headed to Mount Athos with my sons, which will be great, for Holy Week and all that. But yeah, we'll have new content, and the podcast is undergoing a facelift, and so we're going to do new segments where one of the things that we realized is that oftentimes the entry point for my podcast is pretty high, right? Somebody goes, "Oh, the problem of evil. Who's this guy?" And it's like 2.5 hours, part one of seven, right? And that's a high bar to click in on. But so we're starting to move toward segments where it's like, okay, doing 20 to 30-minute episodes while still doing the main episode, right? Still doing
Yeah.
the long form content that I do, but trying to make more accessible videos as part of the plan. Doing a whole new look, right? This will not last. This will
Oh, I remember Nathan back in the days of the studio.
That's right. Yeah, and so anyway, there's a number of things that we're trying to do, and then there's also going to be some toying with rebranding and things like that. I got new producers on the show, so anyway, so that's part of the exploration of really trying to figure out how to, on the one hand, retain the core audience, the people who really do love the content, are loyal, and I'm so grateful for, while also sort of expanding the net to how do we
Yeah.
draw in new people who don't know who I am because there's just too high of an entry point and things like that. So there's going to be a lot going on there, and so anybody wants to search, the Nathan Jacobs podcast, you'll find me. Obviously, if you want to get deeper content, and that's stuff, like I said, where you can support at different tiers and you can get access to my entire audio library of everything I've ever published. You can get, lectures that are not public, like my lecture on modern philosophy, my intro to Orthodoxy course that I did, and things like that. There's all sorts of stuff on there. So you could go to the nathanjacobspodcast.com. If you prefer written stuff, my theological letters, so that's theologicalletters.com, which is my Substack, and that's where I quite literally publish letters that I've written to people and answer to different theology and philosophy questions. And so there's that. And then, like I said, go to the eastwestseries.com. And if you want to support the making of the series, which again, it's being financed by these sort of pre-sales. And the price points that we're offering right now are the lowest it'll be offered, right? Once the series is done and out, those prices will go up. So
Yeah.
it's both a way to support it and a way to get the series before it gets more expensive. So that's the eastwestseries.com. But I think that's probably everything in terms of
Okay.
things that people need to be, mindful of where to find me.